Hey there, folks. Welcome to Spectrum Pulse. We talk about music, movies, art, and culture. And I hate to say it, but this week was full of a lot of disappointments for me. A lot of potentially frustrating and controversial ones, too, so just a friendly warning. But hey, we're all still here, right? So why don't y'all stick with me here on the Pulse? But we got 7 albums on the docket, kind of a slow week, so let's go back a few weeks and talk about From the Orb, Abolition of the Royal Familia. I mean, I gotta give credit to the patron who requests the electronic projects with meaty back catalogs. It has given me an opportunity to flesh out my knowledge of a genre I haven't had the chance to explore a lot. Unfortunately, more often than not, I've been a little bit underwhelmed by what I've heard, so let's talk about The Orb. Long-running project from Dr. Alex Patterson, who moved out of punk into electronic music in the late 80s, and has been putting out projects with a large number of collaborators ever since. And like a lot of electronic acts of that era, it's hard for me to say that The Orb was ever that good, and I'm probably still on the fence about it. I mean, the work was patchy in the 90s and kind of forgettable ever since, embracing a style of spongy, half-ambient electronic music with splashes of dub and house that wasn't really rising to the best of any of what I've even heard from that era. And yes, they've worked with David Gilmour and Robert Fripp, and at one point they were pretty experimental, but it's often felt very unstructured in a lot of its quirkiness, and that's led me thinking that their most potent work was probably 1997's Orblivion, if only because there was a refocus on some really good grooves. Now, from what I've read about Patterson, his method of composition is driven more by the live experience and chopping up some overlong segments for the albums. So maybe that's just the big factor to why I'm so underwhelmed outside of that, but on the other hand, it's 2020, we're now decades removed from The Orb at their best. There have been some really misshapen trend hopping on some recent albums, but Patterson's got a new collaborator in Michael Rendell, and well, it's an album by The Orb, alright. To its credit, it does feel like there's a little bit more of their own distinctive identity to this one than most. The politics will come through in some piecemeal samples that balance out between the heavy-handed and all the quirky. There are some potent ambient passages that can't quite distract from a project that definitely runs long. And once again, the group seems to be trying to do way too much, dabbling with even vocal house and even some electronically assisted reggae that is utterly jarring in the midsection. Hell, for as much as this album wants to rail against British imperialism, it doesn't strike anyone as painfully ironic that they're doing so through adopting some limp imitations of reggae and world music, except their version filters it through some farting synth lines and some bafflingly chosen organic elements. I mean, the best thing I can praise The Orb for is good production and mixing, but that should be par for the course for an electronic project that runs this long. Otherwise, outside of a few pretty moments, I gotta say it, this was a chore. 5 out of 10 was not my thing. Next up from the Mountain Goats, Songs for Pierre Chuvin.
All I do in the night. Keep the chains tight.
Okay, so the story of the Mountain Goats is well known, to start with John Darnielle and his old tape deck boombox, where in the 90s and early 2000s, many of the projects were explicitly lo-fi and recorded there. And this is where I have to differentiate myself from a lot of diehard Mountain Goats fans, because, while I appreciate the boombox years, it's more for the writing than any sort of intrinsic authenticity in the recording. The songs of All Hail West Texas, they're great more in spite of the crackling lo-fi pickups. And while it might be a feature, there are absolutely points where it can be a bug as well. But you know what? In current unprecedented times, it's a nice gimme for the fans and a lift to the band for Darnielle to drag out the old boombox and see if he can pull together a quick throwback. But there's also a lot more going on here. Darnielle has said that this album was inspired by Pierre Chuvin's A Chronicle of the Last Pagans, pulling from ancient Roman history in order to flesh out a series of disconnected stories that can't help but have some modern detail relevant to today's current climate sliding in. And if that sounds like an odd, extremely niche fusion, Well, it is. And this is absolutely a project for die-hard Mountain Goats fans only, especially as it's not all acoustic, as Darnielle occasionally pulls out a keyboard and drum machine that sound even chintzier coming out of that boombox. But that being said, if I were to praise something in the writing here, it does come out thematically, namely in how John Darnielle's primary point of view is often from that of the pagan survivors, who are still rebellious but often crushed underfoot by a now Christianized Roman Empire, until that inevitably falls and those pagans might be able to hold together. And oh, what an obvious parallel to what we're dealing with right now in the face of capitalism in the United States. And if you're a classics nerd or long-running Mountain Goats fan, there's a bunch of great little details to flesh out the stories in parallel, epitomize the best in one hell of a closing track at Exegetic Chains. But this is absolutely not a jump-on point. I'd argue it's best for the die-hard fans. So, you know, one very solid 7 out of 10, with all the caveats I just said in mind. Next up, from Maddie and Tay, The Way It Feels.
This guy to leave me so easy, am I gonna be alright?
I feel really bad for Maddie and Tay. They might have been introduced to a lot of folks as the anti-bro country duo with Girl in a Country Song, but once you move past the novelty, they were really good. The harmonies were consistent, mostly organic. They were decent songwriters. They had a lot of potential, but in retrospect, you can tell their handlers had no idea what to do with them after Girl in a Country Song, which led to the album dropping in 2015, over a full year after their breakthrough, and then their label Dot closed down. They bounced between labels for a bit before landing on Mercury Nashville and starting over, and both of them got married, and now this new project feels like an attempt at a fresh start, presuming, of course, you ignore the fact that 2/3 of this album was already released on EPs the past several months. And well, it certainly feels more openly love-struck, as there are more traditionally structured love songs and overall softer timbres. I get the feeling they're trying to give Maddie and Tay a little bit more versatility, and the fact that duo mostly keep it organic across the board is a huge credit to them, complete with a lot of pedal steel, a lack of programmed percussion, and some surprisingly solid bass lines, even if some of the backing vocal punch-ins can sound pretty obvious. Problem is, the duo is absolutely at their best when they can drill into that unique sense of cutting detail and bring a little bit more verve to songs like Drunk or Lonely or Die From a Broken Heart, or covering New Dog Old Tricks. And that doesn't really translate as strongly to the loving relationship songs that don't have the same dramatic core. They feel sincere, but there's just not a lot else going on. I should also mention there's a song where Dierks Bentley steps up to play the duet counterpoint, which is odd having him sim opposite a duo, but also reminds me of the fact that Maddie and Tay kind of missed the opportunity to sing opposite each other in duets, make more of the narrative, especially for an album that goes for 15 songs and probably could have been trimmed, especially given how many songs were just repeated from the EPs wholesale. But as a whole though, it's certainly good. I'm certainly happy to see them back on their feet, and there really isn't a bad song on the album, but I really wish their label wasn't hedging their bets so obviously at this project's detriment, because there's the capacity for greatness here. So, very light 7 out of 10. If you're curious, it's worth hearing. Next up, from Black Dresses, Peaceful as Hell.
Do I creep you out? Do I creep you out?
So this was another group where I heard about the hype and the backlash before I actually heard them. And what's bizarre is that for a Toronto-based duo, the vast majority of that buzz was online first and foremost, but okay, Black Dresses. The easiest way for me to describe them is to imagine if very early Kesha crossed over with Poppy's industrial side and then made super edgy and very queer noise pop. Honestly, I don't mind it at all. Going through their previous albums, I didn't mind the aesthetic or content, most because I get the feeling they're not going for irony so much as dramatic juxtaposition. But this is a group that could really afford to be more tuneful, especially when you don't have to compromise your transgressive edginess in order to deliver that. Look at Lingua Ignota from last year. Now, thankfully, that is the direction the duo has gradually taken, but I do feel the lyrics have gotten more abstract and fractured, spiraling inwards as they tack on more synthetic vocal layers to obscure some obvious weaknesses there, which does take us to Peaceful as Hell. Probably one of their most composed albums to date, if not their best. Now granted, they've now taken their super online noise tone into a lot of blown out chiptune, and I do feel there's not the same mix depth and swell that came from their industrial side early on, but there's a little bit more structure and melody to a lot of these songs, and they don't quite feel as much like fragments, which I wish the writing was able to capitalize on more. Funnily enough, I don't mind the try-hard edginess and the seething spiral of self-doubt balanced out against some desperate optimism in a collapsing world that this album inhabits. If you spend any time on the internet the past couple of years talking to people their age, even the diction and structure of the writing is very familiar, but I do wish the ideas driving that writing were explored a little bit more deeply, even if you can't expect the coherence. But without some of that structure or poetry that feels more developed, and once you become accustomed to their sonic palette, I hate to say it, but it starts to run together and feel a little bit repetitive to me, which is, given the style of music, that's the last thing you want. When you're trying to be this edgy, there should be more standout, definitive moments. Now, definitely a promising step, but also something gives me the impression I won't revisit this outside of very specific moments. So, very strong 6 out of 10, definitely worth a listen. I'm keeping my eye on them. Next up from Laura Marling, Song for Our Daughter.
Don't want to let you down. Get lost in the crowd.
So recently I went back to re-listen to Laura Marling's entire back catalog, and while I still love I Speak Because I Can and Once I Was an Eagle, there is a certain niche appeal to those projects outside of their more immediate moments. I need to be in a very specific mood to absorb the layered writing and very low-key delivery. Bizarrely enough, the greater sense of charged immediacy and better hooks on the best songs of Short Movie, that's pulled me back more to that album than I thought they would, and more than the generally tasteful, cerebral, and really beautiful high points in Semper Femina. And thus, when out of nowhere Laura Marling announced she was moving up the date for her newest album, which was produced by her former longtime producer Ethan Johns and returning to the stripped-back tones that she nailed at her peak, I'll admit I was more excited than I expected to be for a new Laura Marling album, especially when the rave reviews started pouring in, and man, I really wish I was excited as all the other critics are for this, because while this is quite good, I would struggle to call it great, and it's kind of tough to pin down why, but I think a lot of it comes down to mood and texture, as both I Speak Because I Can and Once I Was an Eagle, they had some distinctive darker passages and real rough edges that tempered the frankness of her writing and some of her delivery. Song for Our Daughter is far smoother and a lot more liquid in its pickups, and even Marling's delivery has softened a bit. It's cleaner and brighter, and I'm sure it can feel reassuring, especially given the subject matter and the current times, but at the same time it runs the risk of feeling a little tepid and not particularly memorable, especially as Marling has fewer moments where her delivery gets more curt and sardonic, which is entirely up my alley. But really, when you dig into the content, it's not surprising. Marling's been writing a selection of relatively bare, intimate songs for an imaginary daughter she might have, building on the frustrating complexities of being a woman in the modern world, with a world-weary maturity and wisdom that's certainly well-formed and empathetic. She's giving out a lot of really solid advice. Even for a lot of the men who are in her orbit, she feels some degree of sympathy. There is some shades to gray to this framing, but there's also a domesticity to this album for which I don't really connect with it. Reminds me of similar cuts from Laurie McKenna, which speaks to parental experiences and emotions I just haven't really had yet. Laura Marling hasn't had them yet, but she does stay in that lane well. And thus, when you combine that with delivery and production that I don't quite love, just kind of lukewarm. It's a solid 7 out of 10. Good, not great. Next up from Nightwish, Human Nature. I've gone on at length surrounding my fondness and love for Nightwish. They were a formative symphonic metal band for me. The Tarja years were instrumental to layering a foundation for the genre, still copied to this day, and they deserved all the success Evanescence wound up getting stateside. And I still posit the Annette years were probably the band at their peak in terms of creativity, hooks, and absolutely massive production. That said, I haven't been wowed by the Floor Jansen years yet, but I figured Endless Forms Most Beautiful would be a transitional project, in which the kinks were ironed out, and this would be the real big smash, especially as it's been 5 years since that last album. And for the most part, I'm gonna focus on the first disc here. The second disc, like off the last album, taken up by a massive, mostly instrumental classical piece with some limited metal elements, and while being very pretty, can feel short on distinctive melodic motifs and interesting dynamic shifts, and it ends on a really awkward note too, which sadly can be a little bit applicable to the first disc as well. Indeed, it's hard not to listen to Human Nature and hear a lot of the same problems as Endless Form's most beautiful. The lack of Marco's raw howls does not help the darker side of the band. That contrast is vital. Sorry, Tridonically, it's just not clicking in the same way. Floor Jansen, she's got more support and multi-tracking, but her cooler vocal timbre doesn't just soar out of the mix with the same force. She's trying to get more visceral, but the production's not really helping her, and the songs don't have the same dynamic swell as previous releases, and the hooks are just weaker. In this case, maybe because it seems like song structure as a whole was a casualty. And yes, Nightwish has used weird or off-kilter song structures before, but they had huge driving hooks that could balance out the gorgeously ethereal with a heavier crunch. Or hell, there was at least a commitment to a dynamic but melodic heaviness that this album it struggles to utilize well, either with songs that fade out on awkward notes, riffs that go for more of a flattened grind than any sort of darker crunch, or stylistic diversions into more futuristic or tribal sounds that feel about as hit and miss as whenever Nightwish has drilled outside of their usual folk side, and I mean that even in their good work. And then we get to the content, which focuses more on the tribulations of modern humanity and the art that brings us all together to transcend, because of course Tuomas is going to hammer on that theme, he's done it for years, all amidst the text that, on the broader scope of space-time, we're all just a part of nature. And maybe it's just me, but not only has Nightwish gone to this thematic well before, as in building off the last album, but outside of the anti-phone addiction screed of Noise and the anti-suicide song How's the Heart, there's this weird, detached lack of deeper humanity on this album. Kind of a shame, because that focal point prior to the Floor years gave the albums a lot of their heart, no matter how self-absorbed and occasionally frustrating they were. What's so damn frustrating is that when this album works in patches, it reminds me of why I love Nightwish. The melodies, the huge production, the killer grooves, a swell that earns the symphonic part of the subgenre better than so many of their peers. But it's overlong, it's inconsistent, it's frequently unbalanced, and given that it's been 5 years to not fix the issues of the last project, this wound up as a huge disappointment. Strong 6 out of 10, I'd say for the fans only, but I don't even think it'll satisfy them. And finally, from The Strokes, the new Abnormal. I'm making bad decisions for you. Here's a question. Is it fair to compare The Strokes anymore to their first two albums? I don't know if it's fair, because they do the same thing with Weezer all the time, but I think there's a significant difference between The Strokes losing their luster after Room on Fire and the backlash to Pinkerton and the loss of Matt Sharp on bass. Now for me, it's actually pretty simple. With each successive album, the tempos got slower, Julian Casablancas has sounded like he'd rather be doing anything else behind the microphone, in this case the voids, which are a very different animal, and the hooks were becoming more spotty and inconsistent. With that happening, the band tried to plug the gaps with genre experimentation and some very obvious callbacks to classic songs that had very mixed results. Now that being said, the albums are still decent. I'm one of the few who actually stick up for some of the bizarre tangents on Come Down Machine, because at least 50-50 kicks a lot of ass. And outside of Casablancas' falsetto, I thought the experimentation landed there, which is more than I can say for how sour and tinny it all sounded on Angles, even if it's probably a more consistent project. Although, hell, back in 2013, I was with everyone else calling Come Down Machine their worst album, and I've fluctuated all over the damn map ever since. That being said, Julian Casablancas has proclaimed this new album as a hard, fresh start, and wow, Casablancas, can you sound like you care at all on this album? Yes, his falsetto has gotten better, not saying much, but his delivery is half-hearted and lacking intensity or tightness even before the auto-tune slides in, which, yes, can work if you're a great lyricist or you can vamp effectively as a magnetic personality, and this is where I'm on the outside in comparison with a lot of fans, because I've never really bought into either. He's always struck me as barely holding together the rock star pose, and a lot of the fun on the best albums came from how he desperately would strong-arm the songs into making them seem believable. So if it sounds like he's not engaged or he's coasting, I stopped caring. But maybe, you know what, maybe that's not fair, because there are moments where he does start hollering opposite production and grooves that don't flatter any of it. Which for a band that's always relied on a hard veneer of cool, is a really wonky mismatch. Like on the slick new wave of Eternal Summer that blows off a good groove to turn into void zest squonking with a terrible ending. Even if thematically was the point, it didn't sound all that good. Now this leads us to the synth choices and some of the lead guitar tones who were chosen. How is it possible for a group with such great compositional instincts? Let me stress this here, there are catchy songs, and yet they keep picking the most blaring, oily blast that can't match the more sinuous presence of the grooves if they try like that synth line on the Brooklyn Bridge to Chorus. And while the choices are more consistent than previous projects, they aren't consistently good. Factor in lulls that seem to show the band constantly on the cusp of running out of gas, not helped by a lot of songs that run long and a serious lack of some good transitions. And I'm stuck looking at the lyrics or anything to really hold on to, desperate times. And while I'd argue social populism is a really weird look for the Strokes, I was more interested in the consistent meta-text and anxiety that reflected angst at the band fractures and never reaching past glories. Which brings me back to my question. Is it fair to the Strokes to compare them to their first two albums? They're clearly anxious about that. Well, here's my answer. In sound, of course they were going to evolve, but I'd like to think they knew their strengths enough to expand from that. And even here, you can tell Julian Casablancas is second-guessing some of those strengths. I don't know, maybe it works for the right audience. Unfortunately, while it's still decent, sonically, doesn't quite work for me. Light 6 out of 10. If you're curious. But yeah, thanks a lot for watching. If you'd like to like and subscribe, I'd be more than grateful. I imagine you guys have a lot of questions and comments. Have fun down there. I know some of you are going to have a lot to say. Apologies for the lateness. I was sick the past couple days, and in today's day and age, health takes precedence. And while we're on that note, if you guys are wanting to not contribute to Patreon at this time because again, unprecedented circumstances, I understand. But hey, if you want to help contribute to my schedule, link to my Patreon right over there. But until then, I'm Mark, you're watching On the Pulse on Spectrum Pulse, and I'll see you next time.